Hello, I'm Allison Thorpe, and this is God Talk, recorded and produced in the bluegrass state of Kentucky, the home of horses, hills, hiking, hillbillies, big trucks, Wildcat basketball, and Daniel Boone, the state where guns are honored and shoes are optional. This is the show where science, faith, and culture are discussed openly.
Good afternoon and welcome to God Talk, a radio show where a rocket scientist and a medical doctor, who is also my pastor, talk about science and religion. I'm your host, Doug Thorpe, and with me as always is my co-host, Dr. Andy Wyatt. Today we are going to talk about one of the most important political issues in America, and that is abortion. So, Andy, please jump in here, please.
Yeah. Well, Doug, it is an important issue, and the reason I think it's so important is it crosses so many lines that are important. As you know, on God Talk, we like to bring everything back to our faith, back to God, our Creator, and relate whatever the topic is, whether it's a political issue, a science issue, an issue of ethics. And actually, abortion crosses all of those. It relates to science. It relates to faith in major ways. It relates to freedom. It relates to our political discussions, and it's a big ethical issue. So this is really a perfect topic for us to discuss on God Talk today, and we may not agree. We may find that we have some different views, but anyway, we'll look at it today. But first,
I think it's so divisive that I hope that we're friends at the end of the day. But
well, I do too, and I hope that you're still in my congregation.
That's right.
We will be, because remember, a lot of times we do disagree on things, Doug, but at the end of the day, we're good friends, and we're
Absolutely.
brothers in Christ, and we may disagree, but I hope that we can present this topic for people to hear the issues and think about it. But first, this is God Talk. This is brain candy for the thinking Christian. We say it's a bad day for the atheist, and it's a provocative question for the seeker.
And this is God Talk, your partner while you commute to work, or a cure for the insomnia. Either it keeps you awake all night and you forget about needing sleep, or you will sleep like a baby. So I think this is going to be a great show. It's a great topic for us to talk about. But I think it's so divisive, and it's used to pick our political leaders, that I think it's actually destroying the country. And let me give you an example.
Well, that's a strong statement. Now, before that, I want to throw out, you say it's used to pick political leaders. I would say that a lot of people use this abortion as a litmus test to decide whether or not they would vote for one candidate or not. If he's pro-choice, I'll vote for him. If he's not pro-life, etc. So it is used as a litmus test by many people, and I don't know if it's destroying America, but I'll hear your argument.
Okay. Well, let me give you an example from where I asked a NASA engineer, who is now a preacher, if he agreed with a political candidate on 99 issues, and those issues could be welfare, health care, immigration, NASA, Middle East, gun control, etc., all those different issues, but slightly disagreed with him on this one issue, where he says life begins at conception, and the candidate says, no, life begins in the first trimester. Would he vote for him, or would he vote for somebody else who only agreed with him on this one issue? And he said the second candidate.
Well, I can understand that, because Christians, the Christian worldview, and this really goes back to a show that we did on Why Theology, which is actually the #1 show as far as downloads so far. And I think people are interested in why we're interested in theology. And I said during that show that your foundational belief system that you see the world through is going to totally change the way you view so many important issues, whether it's abortion, whether it's same-sex marriage, whether it's what's important in life, what kind of job you have. Our worldview is described and defined by our foundational views. And so that person believed so strongly that God Almighty holds life to be so close, and holds life he talks about the sanctity of life. Life is sanctified, life is precious, that humans have value. And if they do, and he believes it starts at conception, then I can understand why he would say that. Although I want to make this point. Although we may disagree when life begins, I think it's a separate question how we vote and where that lays in politics. So we'll have to separate those two issues out.
Well, let me bring up a separate issue. And at a local Nestle plant here, locally, where they make $1 billion worth of Hot Pockets a year. Job one is making Hot Pockets. They send 30,000 to 80,000 pounds of dough to the landfill each day. And I asked them, I said, well, why can't you prepare the dough for some farmers to use it and not send it to the landfill? And they said, job one is making Hot Pockets. Anything you do outside job one distracts from it and makes it less competitive. What is Christian's job one?
Well, that's an important point. You're asking what is the job one of the Christian faith?
Christian faith.
Well, the number one position would be the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. So, I mean, if we had to boil it down, okay, we would say that, to love God with all your heart, and after that to love your neighbor, and then to carry that message to the ends of the earth. However, if you really believe that and live that out, the first part of that commandment is love God with all your heart. If you do that, then however you see any particular issue, you're going to have to say, well, now wait a minute. I'm not going to inform my view of this based on my experience, based on my family, based on my experience with this issue. I'm going to base it on my love for God. So you would start with that because that's the first commandment, to love God with all your heart. And if you love Him, then you would say, what does He have to say about it? So that's, I believe, how these the people you're talking about are making this statement. They would actually vote for a person only if they're pro-life. Now, my problem with that is I don't necessarily think that our politics always has to agree 100% with our faith. And I'll tell you why. The Bible is a plan for how we live our life, not necessarily always for how we vote. And I'll tell you, and we can talk about that as we go.
And okay, I had a problem with that. Well, okay. The second problem is, if Saddam Hussein was still alive, Saddam Hussein was just an absolutely horrible person, and he walked through that door right now and said he wanted to be a devout Christian, we would say, great, but we have to hang these signs in the front yard of all the people that you killed, maimed, or raped. What do you think he would say? Would he say, well, the hell with you, I'm going back and killing more people? Should we hang those signs in the front yard if Saddam Hussein is going to say, hey, I want to be a Christian?
No, but that would be a separate issue. That would be saying that what he did was not forgivable. And, of course, abortion, although it would be considered a sin because God's, the love of His eye, the apple of His eye would be His creation, and the pinnacle of creation would be human life. So to take it, it would be a sin, but just because you did that wouldn't mean it was not forgivable if your heart was willing to change. Now, if he was going to continue killing people in that way, we wouldn't accept him with open arms. We'd say, you can come and hear the message. But to be a part of the Christian faith, you'd have to repent of that. Now, we wouldn't want to publicize it, no, just because it's just a sin like any other sin.
Well, I mean, my point is, by putting those signs out in the front yard, it will just keep him from coming into the faith. He would say, no, I'm not going to allow you to sit there and keep putting these signs in the front yard. If you keep the signs down, and that's the same thing I think the crosses do in the front yard of churches. I think if you was a young lady who had an abortion, or sometime in your life you've had an abortion, you see that cross in there, I think you would say, well, the heck with that church. I'm going to go on down to some place that's, or I'm just going to stay away from church.
I think we're getting the cart before the horse, because if you're going to talk about the post-abortion syndrome and the fact that, a lot of women, many women and many men have participated in abortions because at the time they felt like it was the best option they had. And I wouldn't agree with some of the rhetoric that goes with the Christian faith about abortion or promoting a hatred in any way. I would not be in favor of that. I would want to welcome any person into the church who wanted to find the Lord, who wanted to find God. But here's the difference is, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't say that behavior was wrong, because it's determined by what the Bible says. It's not up to us. But we wouldn't, once the person would confess that and admit, yeah, it was a mistake, I do believe in the sanctity of life because it's God's creation, and I want to become part of this faith. No, I wouldn't hang up crosses. I wouldn't lead marches against abortion clinics. I wouldn't do anything violent against abortionists. We want the abortionists to be saved. We want the people who've had abortions to be saved. We want to love them. But I think the point is we wouldn't compromise the truth of God's word, because I believe he said it for a reason. You know, God believes that his creation is valuable and that human life. So we have to get back to the first, we're going to have to first talk about the argument of whether or not where life begins. What are the arguments for the different ways we can define that? What is the value of human life? But as far as a post-abortion issue, absolutely not. I would not approach it that way. I think we need to open people with welcome arms. Anyone who's had an abortion, you understand there's a post-abortion syndrome. You know that in abortion clinics, if women go in to have an abortion, if the doctor or the nurse or whoever's caring for her will show them an ultrasound of the life, 80% of women will turn around and not have the abortion. The problem is the Planned Parenthood organizations and so many abortion clinics are motivated by money, are motivated by now selling organs. We see on the line selling fetal tissue, which is just horrendously unethical. And they don't want to show the woman the ultrasound and give them an informed choice. So they say we want to be pro-choice, but they only want them to have one choice, to get an abortion. The choice should be educate the woman, entirely about all the options. Because, Doug, I just have to say this. I've seen a lot of women, both in my practice and in life, that carry around a lot of guilt and shame because they've had an abortion, and they're haunted by that. And so if we could find an alternative to that, we would want to, wouldn't we?
Right. Well, you brought up your practice, and that's a good point for us to start. I think on God Talk here that you are absolutely the most perfect person to ask these questions about. You're a preacher as well as you were an OB-GYN doctor for years and years. So I can't imagine anybody else out there who's more qualified to ask these questions. So first of all, let me just
I appreciate that.
Let me interview my co-host here, okay? Dr. Andy, how long were you an OB-GYN doctor?
Well, I did my residency for 4 years in obstetrics and gynecology, and I was a chief resident. And then I practiced in a couple of different settings. So probably all in all about 15 years in the practice of OB-GYN. And then, as you know, I was also an emergency room doctor after that and during that time. But about 15 years I practiced OB.
How many babies did you deliver?
The number would be upwards of almost 5,000. I think
5,000 babies.
Yeah, it'd probably be 4,800, something like that. I don't have the exact number, but and I tell you, every time I go home to Indiana, every single time I go home, I run into some child or some teenager that runs up to me, or even a grown person now, an adult, and comes up and says, "You delivered me." And I say, "Well, do you mean I delivered your soul or delivered your body?" Because I'm a pastor too, and if it was that many years ago, it was their body. I delivered them. So yeah, delivered almost 5,000 babies.
Did you have any complications where the mother's life was at risk?
Oh, absolutely. And that was something I dealt with on a daily basis almost, as far as high-risk obstetrical problems, things like high blood pressure, hemorrhage, preterm labor, both where the baby and the mom are at risk many times. So it's something I've dealt with in depth, definitely, and I've probably seen every complication there is to see in obstetrics.
Right. Well, we talked about have you ever performed abortion, but you didn't go down that route.
No, I didn't. And when I was a resident, we were required to choose whether we wanted to go down the track of. Now, when I say abortion, now to be real clear about something, medically and even philosophically, I'm talking about elective abortions or abortions, terminations of pregnancy, not for medical indications. So I'm not talking about doing a D&C or a dilation, evacuation of a fetus who's already died. So I've done those procedures. I mean, that's part of my training. I'm not talking about doing, even a termination in a mother who who's bleeding out and would die if we didn't perform the procedure. So I'm talking about doing elective termination. I have to be very clear about that. Doing what we would call terminations or abortions, as an obstetrician is really a part of daily life. But that's different than doing elective termination. So I have to be real clear about that. So we were asked, do you want to do the track of training that includes doing elective terminations, or do you not? And to be honest, at that time, I was not a Christian. At that time, I would have been an agnostic. Wasn't particularly concerned about faith in any way. And we could have made more money if we would have chose to do that track, because it was fairly lucrative. As a resident, you always need more money. And so the likely thing I would have done would have been to have done that. And to this day, I don't have a reason why I said no, other than that God Almighty prevented me from doing it. But I really don't know. I just felt like, I don't know if I want to do that. I feel a little uneasy about, I had questions. I'm like, I don't know. At that time, I was obviously a young guy, just out of medical school, didn't know that much about life, wasn't particularly wise, but I had questions and thought, I don't know if I want to go down the route of terminating babies when I'm not sure where I stand on the issue. So I said no, and I chose to make money working in emergency rooms instead.
Well, I can't imagine how you would felt if you had gone through and perform abortions and passing by churches with a bunch of crosses out in the front yard.
Well, I would, whether I did them or not, I would have not at that time and not particularly now agree with that approach. I think the point of that is to try to remind people of the issue of the lives that are lost when we terminate millions and millions of babies every year who have a life and have no say in the matter. And I'm going to make the plea for the fact, though, that that's really a power play. The person who is alive has no say-so over their outcome. And at one time, I was an embryo. And at one time, you were an embryo. And if our mothers would have chose that it was inconvenient for them, we wouldn't be here. So the whole thing comes down to this. And we'll have to cover this in many different ways. But it's going to come down to this argument. Who is in charge, man or God? And if God is sovereign and he's in control, and then a life forms, then I would say it's his to take or not. So back to your question, I did not decide to do abortions electively, but of course I had to perform medical inductions at times and medical abortions for medical reasons.
Right. Well, and I understand that, if a baby was, still alive, but he's going to die and the mother's going to die, mm-hmm. It's like, well, I can terminate this pregnancy and save the mother's life. And that, to me, seems like what you should do.
That point, now I will say, and you're going to hear politicians say those cases don't exist. I believe it's Scott Walker who's running for president, right. and I think I don't dislike Scott Walker. I like him as a candidate. He's not my favorite candidate, but he's got a lot of things to say. My sister doesn't like him. She lives in Milwaukee, and she's not a fan of him in Wisconsin. But I think he's right on a lot of issues. But I think he's a little bit wrong on this issue. The fact that he says it's never an issue, and I would disagree. It's rarely an issue that you have to choose between doing a termination and saving the mother's life. But let me assure you something. If it was never an issue, if there was no such thing as ever having to choose between the mother's life and the baby's life, you would never hear that come up. And we do hear it come up. I think he's right to say it's overrated, because if we only did terminations on women whose life was in danger, oh my, there wouldn't be any crosses in any fields anywhere, because the number of terminations would be so few that it wouldn't really be an issue. It would be a decision between a doctor and a family, which I think that's where it it needs to be.
Well, basically, every tubal pregnancy has got to end. It's never going to.
That's correct, but a tubal pregnancy, of course, is never a viable pregnancy. It is a conceptious that gets stuck in the tube, and if it's not removed, it will rupture, and the mother will bleed to death. So, I mean, it's not. I mean, if I was okay, let me give you that as an example. That's one of the things I'm talking about. I've done hundreds of surgeries for tubal pregnancies, and I can assure you with 100% confidence that there is no option except to terminate that or operate on that mother. It'd be a malpractice case 100% of the time, and you would lose every time. So you could not practice obstetrics and gynecology at all if you didn't treat ectopic pregnancies as a disease instead of a pregnancy. I mean, that it is a conceptious, but it is going to end in death. I mean, there's never been a case that pregnancy survived. So you have a 0% survival rate with an ectopic pregnancy. You have a 100% rate of it causing problems, usually hemorrhage and death in the mother. So right there is a case that I would argue with Scott Walker that happens in hospitals every day of the week, or every week at least there's an ectopic. I happen to see a lot of tubal pregnancies in my career. I don't know why, but I just saw a lot of those cases, and you have to operate on those patients.
All right. Well, let me switch gears.
Okay.
And we talk more about law and tri-mesters. How are tri-mesters defined? Is there anything special about one versus another, or is it just a man-made period of time?
Yeah, it's really man-made, but there are some special medical things. We define the trimesters based on basically the first 14 weeks, the next 14 weeks, and the last 14 essentially, because pregnancy is normally 40 weeks. Now, the importance of that, and I teach my students that in the first trimester there are different diseases and problems you look for than the third trimester. For an example, preeclampsia or high blood pressure in pregnancy that can be very dangerous. It's a high-risk problem. That really only develops in the third trimester. Okay, you never see that in the first trimester. And you can see patients who have chronic hypertension in the first trimester, but you don't see preeclampsia, or what we call toxemia of pregnancy. You don't see that until the third trimester, when the mother develops protein in the urine, a kidney problem, very high blood pressure, and swelling all over her body. And if you don't deliver that baby, the mother will eventually have seizures and die.
Well, my sister-in-law was definitely susceptible to toxemia.
Okay, so toxemia is a third trimester problem. So they are man-made inventions in that doctors, have divided the pregnancy into 3 different trimesters to look for certain problems, certain risk factors that pop up. So they're artificial because to the baby, as far as the baby is concerned, you have conception and the cells begin to divide, and it goes through a process from conception, which is 48 hours after ovulation, all the way up to delivery, and then it enters life and goes all the way through life until it becomes elderly and dies. And my argument would be that really, from a philosophical standpoint, conception to death is really one developmental process. And it's very artificial to try to say life begins at 6 weeks or at 24 weeks or at birth. If it's a human, it's a human, and so it would begin at conception in my feeling. As a doctor, really. I think that's the only argument I can make.
All right, wait a minute now. Let me talk about that. You said life begins at conception, and I have no problem with that. But my pinky is alive. Right? My hair follicles, well, my wife would say, when I had hair, I had hair follicles, and they are alive. Are you talking about life or sanctified life, or sanctioned life?
Mm-hmm.
Sanctioned life means the full power of the government and the law is protecting that life. So what type of life are you defining as at conception?
Yeah. I would say that from the time you have life is defined by the definition of biology. It's not defined by law, it's defined by biology. So life would be defined as the ability to reproduce, the use of energy and metabolism, boundary. There's a boundary between life and non-life. There's organization in the life. There is a reproducible pattern that we know what's going to happen. We can follow it through. It does the same thing every time. And so actually it's pretty well defined. Life would be, see, I think I got them all. Capacity for growth. It has to be growing. Has to be able to reproduce, have some kind of functional activity. Has to have a boundary and use energy. So by that definition of life, the morula, which is a ball of cells, or even the conception, which would happen right after ovulation, within 48 hours, you've got the sperm enters the egg, and as they come together, they form a new creature. So that the sperm was alive,
right,
and the egg was alive, and now those cease to be. And philosophically, a new creature comes into being at the time the new conceptus forms. And then it begins to follow a pattern. It meets all the criteria for life. It has boundaries, uses energy, has a capacity to grow, and it's growing. So it would really be artificial, honestly, Doug, to make a distinction and say, well, when you have a ball of cells, it's not really human, and it is human when it has a heartbeat, or it would be human when it reaches viability at 24 weeks or 21 weeks, or when it's born. I used to think that way, and then as a scientist, I really looked at it, and a philosopher both, and say, I can't really make those distinctions. They're not mine to make. All I know is it would be alive at that point, at the conception, and it would be alive at birth, and it would be alive as they live through life and in the elderly. It'd be the same thing by saying an elderly person who was in demise, euthanasia would bring up the same debate. Should we just terminate those people because they're really not contributing to society? They don't have a lot of value in life. We know they're going to die anyway. So let's just make it easier because we don't have to pay for all that end-of-life care. I mean, it's really the same argument, whether or not you terminate it on either side.
Oh, wait a minute now. Since we're into politics, we're talking about government. When should government look at this life and say, this is sanctioned life? Mm-hmm. If you terminate it, then we have to have a police officer come to the hospital, do an investigation, and find out why did this life terminate. And
well, we could if we wanted to do it, because every abortion would be up for that kind of problem. I mean, if you terminated a life,
even tubal pregnancies, any type of miscarriage.
No, that's.
I mean, the government doesn't see any difference in life and life and life. So when you say you're sanctioned life at conception, they won't see any difference. I mean, the law treats everybody the same.
Right, but no, there would be, obviously, they would have to investigate that. But if you show that it's going to end in death, then for the mother, then you have a reason. You have a reason to say, I've discussed this, and so this is not a viable life in any way, shape, or form. At that point, it's just cells. Okay, it's not growing anymore. Or you just say, I'm going to terminate this pregnancy because if I don't, this mother's going to bleed to death. Those are extreme cases. Those are exceptions to the rule, but it would still be life defined philosophically, because we can only define life by that definition I just read. And if it meets those criteria, then we would have to call it life. And any time that we end it, we have to suggest this is alive. Now,
what would happen if the mother tried and had one miscarriage after another? Pretty soon the police are going to say, oh, well, this is a serial killer here, because I mean, they have to treat everybody,
not a natural miscarriage. No, well, it's not the same thing.
As far as the government is concerned,
no, it's not the same thing.
They have to treat everything the same.
No, that's not the same thing. A miscarriage that happens naturally is just part of the menstrual cycle, and if that happens, it happens. But if you go in and actively try to eliminate a life, that's different. It's not the same thing at all. A miscarriage that happens naturally is part of nature. I mean, it isn't compatible with life. The mother miscarries, that would not be the same thing. You're making a huge jump there. We're talking about doing something actively to end a life versus a person dying. I mean, that would be like saying you have to investigate every person that dies. We don't do that. If we think there was foul play, we do. But we don't investigate every single death. I mean, if somebody's 95 years old and they die of heart failure, you still have to fill a certificate out maybe, but we accept that. I mean, we don't want to go beyond reason here and just think that, I mean, that gets to be ridiculous. I mean, if there's a process that happens, that's one thing. But how we actually call it and define it, the only reason that I believe this is biologically it makes sense, but secondly, it's what Scripture would say. We should hold life. We can't make life. We can't make life. So why should we be able to take it?
Well,
I don't believe we should have any reason to take life if we can't make it.
Well, this has all been brought up from the 1973, I think, Supreme Court ruling on Roe versus Wade. And by the way, her name wasn't really Jane Roe. That's a fictitious name for Mrs. McCreary, I think is what her real name was. Anyway, they said it was a right to privacy under the due process of the 14th Amendment clause, which is kind of funny that Huckabee brought that up in the debate the other night. He's going to use the 14th Amendment to stop abortions. But anyway, they extended their woman's decision to have an abortion and said that, it changed over time. So, the woman has the right in the first trimester, but as it progresses, the pregnancy progresses, then she does not. They start restricting her right to have an abortion. That is from the 1972 ruling. And then in a later case, they says, they threw out the third trimester and said that the right to abortion until viability. And that, I think viability, if you can jump in here, is that 28 weeks or even
21 weeks?
21
weeks, yeah. But let's get back to the basic question before we get to the law, because this law is man-made and it's not necessarily real. It's just a legal discussion. They can make anything legal. But I want to go back to this. Can you tell me for sure that a life growing in a woman, that's not a human being? Can you tell me for sure that you know that and you'll meet your God and say, I have no problem with that? That embryo at 3 weeks or at 12 weeks or at 16 weeks, whatever cutoff you want to make, can you tell me for sure that's not a human?
Oh, maybe I can explain it this way.
No, I just want a yes or no.
Well,
can you tell me yes or no? You don't know, is the truth. Okay, so if you had a building burning and I said there might be some people in there, will you go get them? Or let me tell you a better one. If I have a building and I say, we're going to blow this building up, but there might be some people in there, would we go ahead and blow it up, or would we go in and check and see if there were some people? We don't know if there's any life in there, but I wouldn't set the bomb off until you go in and check. So my argument is you don't know whether it's human or not. You're having to make up some false distinctions about that. We don't know if it is.
Well,
and if it is, why would you choose to say it's okay to end it and do that and answer for that?
Well, let me ask you a question. Is there anything special you do to the fetus to start the heart at 6 weeks or 8 weeks? I mean, do you yell out clear and then hit it with a shock the heart to start it, or do you have to do anything to start it?
No, but it's probably beating before that. We just don't detect it until 5 to 6 weeks. That's when we can actually see it. But let me give you this example. Are you going to say if the heart's not beating, it's not human? If you want to go down that argument, let me ask you this one. If you got somebody, if that's the case, then if you got somebody in cardiac surgery, they don't have a heartbeat, so we should be able to kill them. Or what about somebody who's undergoing CPR? Their heart's not beating, so we should just go ahead and it wouldn't be illegal to kill them because they're not really a human if their heart's not beating. Can't really use that as a distinction.
But they can start. I mean, it was beating. I mean, you're there to get the heart started. I mean, sometimes I know where somebody was working on a heart pump. I mean, he was actually using his hand to pump a man's heart. And they says, well, you can't do that forever. You just got to let him go and let him die. So he let go of the man's heart and watched him die. I mean,
Sure. But the point is, though, it goes back to, is the embryo a human or not? First of all, what is it if it isn't human? I can't think of anything that it would be. It has human DNA. It meets the criteria for life. It uses energy, has boundaries, has capacity for growth, reproduces itself. It's growing. It's alive. So it's alive. We all know that, and it is human. So if it's a human life, the second part of that would be that it has value, just like any other human life. Why would that particular life have less value than letting it go 2 months later, or 3 months later, or 12 months later, or 50 years later? It's still the same DNA. It's still the same soul. So once it's alive and it's human, it's got value. It either is a human or it isn't. And if it is, then any distinction we make is a false distinction. It's just a man-made distinction. So you can talk about Roe versus Wade, but that's just a man-made law that says, okay, we want to give people the right to do this. Well, we can give them a right to do anything, but that doesn't mean it's right in God's eyes.
when does the human, receive the soul?
That's a good question. Before I tell you that, though, this is from an embryology textbook by Moore and it's by TVM. This is a human embryology. Here's a quote. A zygote, quote unquote, a zygote is the beginning of a new human being. Human development begins at fertilization and is a unique individual. That's a quote from an embryology textbook. So biologists really don't disagree about this point, that life begins at conception. It really comes down to the fact of whether or not you believe some people's lives have more worth than others. So it's really the same argument as saying slavery. Abraham Lincoln said, you're putting these people into slavery, and so what you're saying is you're using your power to play over a certain group, whether it be an ethnic group or whether it be a race or something like that. You're using your power to enslave these people. So you're saying their life doesn't have as much value as this other life. It's the same thing here. When you choose to do an abortion electively, to take away that life, you're actually saying it doesn't have as much worth as another life, so it's a power play. And I don't really know how to get around that. I mean, if it's alive, it's alive. If it's human, and it has value. Now, when does the soul come into it? We don't really know that, but my theory would be, now the basic spectrum here would be that the soul enters the body at conception. That's the primary Christian belief. Others would, there are some who have more of a liberal faith would say the soul comes into the conception at birth or right before the birth. You have a baby that is soulless until birth.
Or at least at implantation. If the embryo doesn't implant, then it's just going to, it's like...
And technically, that's right. If it doesn't implant, another place would be implantation, another place would be viability, all these different places. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I'm not going to say that I know. My belief is that it probably happens with conception. Now, if it doesn't implant, then, I've heard you say before an IUD then would be an abortion. And
that's
technically
right.
It would.
Yeah.
And it would be. I mean, I would agree with that. It wouldn't be my recommendation for birth control,
But I know lots of good Christian
women. Oh, sure.
Women
Well, they are, but that doesn't mean they're doing everything right. They may be Christians, but maybe they don't know. Maybe they're uneducated. I would bet if you ask those women, 90% of them don't understand how it works. The birth control pill prevents ovulation. So it really works by preventing a conceptuous, so that wouldn't really be in the same ballpark. Now, you can go as extreme as the Catholics and say you can't have any birth control.
Well,
That is
that was my
view.
next point. Was it's picking the spot where you're saying that life begins could be considered religion. The Catholics and the Mormons pick before birth. Before birth, even using birth control is is a sin. So,
Well, I don't see any basis for that biologically, though. I try to make the decisions based on a combination of science and faith. And so bringing those two together, it makes the most sense to me from what the Bible says and science would say that it begins when the sperm ceases to be, the egg ceases to be, and a new union comes together and has a unique identity, a unique DNA, and meets the qualifications for life. So if we want to move that forward, you can do that, but I don't see any way to make that argument consistent. It'll fall apart. Either it has value at that point or not. And you're right. These are the hard points about it. In the fact, you're right about one thing: the fact that if it,
well,
and that's
I'm
about
glad
it.
you allowed
But
me.
you're right about that. In that, if you call that a life, then yes, technically. If they had a miscarriage, it wouldn't be a forensic problem. I don't agree with that, but it would be a conception, and that baby, if it has a soul, would be in heaven. And somebody raised the question on a show that I was listening to a few months ago. Said, if that's the case, then when we get to heaven, it's going to be overflooded with all these babies from miscarriages and ectopic pregnancies and abortions. There's going to be the majority of the people there have never lived on Earth.
That's right.
And in fact, that would be the case. But that doesn't mean it can't be. It doesn't mean it's not right just because it seems strange or something. If that's the way it is, that's the way it is. Here's another thing about it, Doug, and that I've preached this too from the pulpit, is that I've come to find in my life that the safest thing to do is to hug the mountain or to be in the center of the boat. And I don't mean that in a preachy kind of like be perfect way. I don't mean that. I just mean that when you're trying to make decisions and worldview decisions, that doesn't mean we don't give forgiveness. It doesn't mean we don't understand people that do this and mess up. Absolutely, I understand that, and I love them just the same. But that doesn't mean we call it right. It's kind of like if my son grows up and I love him to death, and if he grows up and does something that just I totally disagree with, that by no means would be a reason why I would say, Jude, I'm going to disown you, or you can't come to church anymore, or I'm not going to support you because you did. No, not at all. I would still call sin, and right, and try to teach him why I think that, but at the same time, I would love him. And as Kasich made that point, the Ohio governor in the Republican debate, I thought that was a good answer. So, I don't want to come across here in any way as being unloving or unaccepting. It's just that if we get down to brass tacks and talk about what it is, we have to call it like we see it. So anyway, that's kind of where I am at this point. Now, so that's why. Now, let me ask you, where do you think it begins?
Well,
what's your argument for where it begins?
I really seriously think that life begins with a heartbeat.
Okay.
That's an easy point to point at and says, hey, I had this thing didn't have a heartbeat before. Now it has a heartbeat. That's kind of a moderate point of view. A woman has missed 2 periods almost. Maybe by that time they ought to know, hey, either I'm pregnant or I'm not. They ought to be able to make a decision. So, and this gives a way out so that as far as a political view,
and
that a woman doesn't have, otherwise, if you dig in your heels, the other side is going to say these guys are extremists, and that was like Huckabee and Scott Walker, where he dug in his heels and says.
All right. And I understand what you're saying, though. But let me back up. Philosophically, I don't think it'll work. Although I understand what you're saying as a non-physician, I can understand why you think that. But it doesn't really, the being of the thing, whether it had a heartbeat 1 minute and the next minute doesn't, is not really the sign of life. It doesn't fit the definition. The definition of life isn't defined by having a heartbeat. But I understand why emotionally that seems like a good argument.
Well, I mean, we've seen plenty of times that abortion stops a beating heart. Well, if there is no beating heart, then you have
but it's going to beat. I mean, we know if it's implanted and it's in a uterus and it's in a healthy situation and it's 4 weeks, we can look at it and measure it and say, yep, everything's fine. It just we can't detect the heartbeat yet. It doesn't mean it isn't. We just can't see it. The organs are all formed. The nervous system is formed. And, I mean, to make that distinction is just to make you feel better. But really, it's not true. I mean, it's still the same because we know in 2 weeks it's going to have a heartbeat. Now, if it goes past that time and the heart never beats and we say this is not growing anymore, it's dead, well, that's a totally different argument, you see. But if it's still growing, we know it's going to start at 6 weeks. And so it's an artificial distinction. But I understand why people do that to make it sound better. But my question would be, though, why would we want to say it's okay to do it up to 6 weeks? What would be the argument for a good reason to have an abortion?
Well,
I mean, other than medical. See, I mean, in medical, yeah, if you've got two lives competing against each other, I would be on your side on that one. I would say, no, if we have to choose between two lives, we've already got a woman alive and she's going to die if we don't terminate this pregnancy. I'm in. I understand that. And I feel like if I have to answer for that, I have to answer for that. But to just say, all right, it's 5 weeks, there's no heartbeat yet that we can detect, it's okay for you to have an abortion. I can't go there because I know what the post-abortion syndrome brings to the woman, and I would say, why do you need to do that? Why do you need to terminate a life? Why are you going to use your power over this life? Why do you have the right to do that? I can't think of any good reason.
Are you talking about good reason as far as faith or good reason as
No,
far as
good reason
medical?
at all. I mean, what would be the reason for anybody to have? Why would we want that? My question is, you say, well, they dig in their heels and seem extremists. Why is it extreme? I mean, why is it extreme to say, this is when life is, if you're going to terminate it, that can't be legal because we can't kill a human life. Unless you have a medical indication to do this. See what I mean? Why would we do that? And I can tell you the top reasons, I wrote them down, are...
Well, I know there's medical reasons, but...
No, just, I mean, other than medical reasons, the answers are going to be things like, well, I didn't really want to get pregnant. 98% of abortions are done for these reasons, birth control. Didn't know they were pregnant, afraid to tell their partner that they're pregnant, their relationship changed, their circumstances changed. They couldn't get their arrangements made to have it done earlier. So 98% of abortions that we see are basically done for birth control. 2% of late abortions are due to fetal problems. So if we're talking about late abortions, and that would mean second trimester, you define that differently. JAMA defines a late abortion anywhere from 16 weeks to 28 weeks. Okay, depending on what article you read and what year.
That's second or third trimester?
Yeah, second and early third trimester. But that would be termed late. Medically, we would divide it into early abortion and late-term abortion.
Now,
but that doesn't get around the philosophical argument.
Well, what about elective abortions? Are there third trimester abortions out there? Are they being performed? Elective?
They are. In certain states, again, the articles would say they go from 16 to 28 weeks. So there are partial birth abortions and third trimester abortions performed in some states, in some countries. They're not done in great amounts. They would be somewhere in the thousands in this country. Well, so not like millions, but thousands of those, yeah.
They were talking about harvesting parts. All right, if you're at 6 weeks and the heart hasn't started beating yet, is there parts there that you can harvest, or is this?
There are, yeah. There are stem cells. There are still tissues that you can grow. Yeah.
But they were talking about, we can get.
Well, most of those things they're talking about bigger babies, I think.
Right.
But regardless, that's a whole other issue. That's an ethical issue that I don't see any grounding for. I mean, I don't see how they can do that. I think that's pretty radical.
Well, even the third trimester, they should, if you have a candidate, this is all talking about politics. If you have a candidate who says, I'm going to start here, that way he gets the most votes, and you're most likely to get this guy in there who at least agrees part of the way with you, as opposed to if you got somebody that's going to dig their heels in and says, nope, I don't care even if the woman dies, I don't care. That's going to guarantee the other side wins.
I agree. And see, that's where I say we have to separate, I think, as a pastor now I'm talking, I think we have to separate our political votes from our faith sometimes. Now, I know a lot of people aren't going to agree with me on that.
Absolutely, they're not.
But yeah, but I mean, I think it's a matter of practicality. It's a matter of making your vote count. It's a matter of having the optimal political party, because your faith is really separate from your politics. It really is. As a Christian, our faith doesn't reside in politics. We can have good leaders, we can have bad leaders. God's in charge of all of them. Principalities, powers, thrones, he's in charge of it all. God uses sometimes unbiblical leaders for his will to be done. We've seen it done in the Bible a lot. So I mean, I think we have to be real careful here about teasing apart our political choice and say, but it's okay to say, I'm going to vote for this guy because I believe he's the best choice for the country overall, although I disagree with him on certain faith issues. Okay, I mean, it was like the last election. There were all these Christians that said, I'm not going to vote for Romney because he's a Mormon. Well, I agree. He's not a Christian by my view. I mean, he doesn't fit he's not an Orthodox Christian. He's a moral person, okay? He had a lot of economic issues that I shared. He had a lot of other conservative issues that I shared with him. Now, do I agree with him on religion? No. But does that mean I can't support him as a political candidate? Oh, I see no reason why not. Because if I don't vote for him, I'm going to get Obama, who's going to be much farther away from what I think the country. Well, you see my point?
That's exactly
There's nothing wrong with voting for him.
Well, and that's exactly what I'm talking about is by digging in your heels and pointing, getting the guy who's absolutely the most radical. You're going to chase the middle ground people, the agnostics and the
independents,
mm-hmm. And they're going to say, well, look at these guys. They're so far off to the right that we're going to go vote for this guy, even though we don't like him, but at least he's more practical.
Well, you're mixing the discussion a little bit, because if you're talking about the political issue, I agree. I think you don't always have to use it as a litmus test. That's what I was said at the very beginning, is some people will use abortion. My mother-in-law does it. I mean, if they're not pro-life in the strictest sense, she will not vote for them. I don't agree with that.
And I don't.
But that doesn't mean I don't think life begins at conception. See, you can hold both of those views, I think, and hold them together.
Well, it's a matter of what do you want to get. If you can get a candidate who is moderate, who can get the moderate vote and the independents, and he says, well, we'll do no abortions after a heartbeat. That way, now you're getting, all the people. There's no way you can dispute that. The liberals can't dispute it. Well, if it's got a heartbeat, then it's alive. I mean, even vegetarians do that. They want to eat things with a heartbeat, or even had a heartbeat. So that's the way you now get a candidate. After that, you can go after moving it on to the, like you said, further back in time. Says, okay, now we have no abortions after a heartbeat. How about we just keep moving that line back? You make a compromise, and then you can later on hopefully get a better candidate who can say, okay, life begins at conception.
Right, and I agree with that. And the whole thing about it saying I think life begins at conception, I want to be real clear. It's based on a philosophical argument, on a biblical argument, and on a science argument. I try to be consistent with the arguments. In other words, if the life does begin at conception and it ends at death, by that logic, all life would have value and would be equal under God. And size, the level of development, the environment that it's in, and the degree of dependency on something else wouldn't change their rights. So I would agree with that, and I think that has to be my opinion, and I have to stay there. But I would agree with you in that I don't think that we should say there's no exceptions to that rule, because I think rigidity like that doesn't work. You get things like prohibition, with alcohol. And so it says, see, there's two different arguments to me, and we're kind of crossing back and forth. Part of why we're disagreeing, I think, is we're crossing between two arguments. The first argument is, when does life begin, and why do we think that? Second argument is, politically and legally, how do we deal with that whole issue? And I think we're probably closer together on how we would deal with it legally and forensically and politically. We may differ on where we set the line at life, and I respect your opinion. I just don't agree. But I do understand why you say it. But I think the better thing to do is, here would be what I would say, hold to the safest version of when life begins as a Christian. But with your vote and politically, be willing to make exceptions to that rule to live in society. Things like, if the mother's life is at risk, that's an exception. Is rape an exception? Now, most Christians would say no. But again, is there room for that? Sure. There's room to argue those things. I think when you get into the elective terminations in any trimester, but when they're just simply for birth control, I think you'll find that the majority of those abortions could have been handled another way. And if there is abortion available, people will use, not think about other kinds of birth control, not worry about having sex. Oh, if I get pregnant, I can just end it in abortion. That's a very frivolous way to think about life that I feel like is not Christian and not appropriate, but that's just my opinion.
That sounds a good place to stop.
Probably so. We're probably going to need to continue this one with another God Talk. But this is God Talk, where we faithfully examine science and we reasonably examine faith.
And this is God Talk, where we rightly divide the line between science and faith. Thank you.